Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Last episode we played part 1 of the interview with biblical scholar Dr Michael Heiser. Check that out on our website if you haven't heard it yet. Today we have part 2, and in parts 1 and 2 we spoke about things such as the Tower of Babel, authors and origins of the Bible, and whether there's any borrowing from other religions. We also touched on the Bible code, ancient alien theory and prophecy. Before we listen to it though, let's get a reaction from Anthony K in Kazakhstan, a self-confessed atheist. Anthony, what's your reaction to what you heard?
Yeah, Scott, I know I am kind of the token atheist at Truth Sentinel, but actually I'm fascinated with biblical scholarship, and I read a lot of it. Regarding Michael and his points, I think he makes a lot of interesting observations, and I think he's right in saying that people often try to take the Bible and kind of press it into service in ways that the authors never intended. The idea, for example, that this Near Eastern text, written something like 3,000 years ago, could influence our views on stem cell research is a little ridiculous. But I also think it's worth putting the Abrahamic faiths into the context of world religions, because they're unusual in several ways. And one big point of difference is that they are kind of focused on the historicity of the events in their texts. I mean, if you imagine, like, you're a biblical scholar, right, and a friend invites you to a house party, you know that when people find out what you do, they're going to ask you questions like, oh, right, so did the Garden of Eden really happen? Is the flood real? And this concept of did it really happen is quite specific to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. It's not typical of world religions. Most religions tend to exist outside of linear history. They talk about truths that are eternal, or they talk about cyclical time. If you take, ancient Egypt as an example, the people there observed things like, the sun's journey across the sky each day and the flooding of the Nile each year. And from that, they constructed this concept of mat, which is the idea of like worship as a way to help the earth renew itself. And Mat was a cycle, not an arrow through time pointing in one direction.
But
that's quite...
Don't atheists believe that timelines are chronological with a beginning and an end?
Well, that's true, but atheists in at least atheists in Western societies, they're a product of Western society, and so is Christianity, and vice versa to some extent. If you look at the stories in the Bible, I mean the central one is of course Jesus dying for the sins of humankind, and this happened once only, and so it becomes then a historical event which you have to locate in time.
Can't you only die once though?
Well, according to many religious stories, in fact, the vast majority of religious stories around the world, no, you can die as many times as you like, and this is what makes it unusual. I think there are some advantages to it. I also think it does feed into a kind of literalist approach that you get to the Bible, unfortunately. When you get these kind of fundamentalists in America trying to ban the teaching of evolution in schools because it supposedly contradicts some details of Genesis, that kind of thing I think is completely unnecessary. I really think that the main messages in the text are far more important than whether a specific detail is true or not. And yes, you can send archaeologists out to try and find a boat on Mount Ararat, but I just don't think that really is the point of being a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or anything.
So you saying my trip to Ararat when I was younger was a wasted journey?
Not at all, and I'd go for sure, but I wouldn't. I'd go just for sheer curiosity value. I think though that listening to Michael as I've been doing today, although he is approaching this clearly as a committed Christian, and I'm not at all. I have to say I find myself agreeing with 99% of what he says. So yeah, I hope the listeners enjoy the interview. I certainly did.
Let's go over to him now and listen to part 2. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Again, it doesn't have to be direct borrowing. There's a lot of that, but there are also really, really crucial differences. Well, I'll give you one today. Okay, Islam is monotheistic, and so is Judaism, so is Christianity. If you think they're teaching the same things, you're just terribly mistaken. And I'm talking theology here. I'm not talking politically. Christianity has a Trinity. Okay, the Old Testament has God, plural Elohim, and also God in human form. The Quran explicitly, militantly denies both of those things, but yet they're both monotheistic. They both have the same cultural, regional context. Well, yeah, they do. But you'd have to be an idiot to say that, they basically teach the same things. That tells me you haven't read any of it. Okay, there are clear, fundamental, crucial differences between what the texts are saying, what they're asking, their followers to adhere to in terms of belief systems.
And are there any other religious texts that mention virgin births and 12 disciples or 12 followers of any kind and resurrections?
Well, let's take resurrect. The answer would be, it depends how you, this is going to sound crazy. It depends how you define virgin. I'll give you an example, because like at Ugarit, you have the goddess, you have Anat, and you have other goddesses, but we'll just pick Anat. Anat is called a virgin, okay, but she's also a whore. She's the mistress of other gods. Well, she's not a sexual virgin, so what do we mean by this virgin type? And again, they have their own definition for that. It's typically it's a term you would use sort of in a cultic sense, where it has to do with the concepts of sacred marriage and whatnot. So yeah, it depends, because you have sacred marriage ideas across the board in ancient Near Eastern texts. And they mostly don't involve true sexual virginity of a human woman. Typically this language is used of some sort of goddess figure. But in the Gospels, it's very clearly a human woman. It's very clearly literal virginity, because we get added details. Joseph did not know, his wife Mary until after she had given birth to Jesus. You have these lines in there to distinguish the way we're talking about this as opposed to the way somebody else would talk about it. So, the writers are, use care in that sense, because they know they have to tell you what's going on here, as opposed to, what you might think when you read the passage. Resurrection, again, it depends how you define resurrection. Does resurrection mean that when a god or let's just take Baal. Because Baal at Ugarit is typically viewed as a resurrection figure. Well, first of all, Baal was never born incarnate of a human woman and didn't physically die and then rose in the same body. But Baal does have, he does go to war with death and defeats death, the god Mot, in his, effort for co-rulership of the gods in the pantheon at Canaan. The two ideas are not the same. Even Egypt, the whole Isis Osiris cycle. Yeah, Osiris is dead, and he's raised from the dead. He becomes animated back to life. Yeah, he does, but guess what? He's Lord of the Dead, and he's always depicted as green, which means he's cadaverous. This is not the resurrection idea that you get in the Gospels. So it just depends how things are talked about, and really, I'll say this. How much respect people have for each text that they're talking about. The Zeitgeist people, will look at Osiris and they'll try to make it sound like the New Testament, and in doing so, they deliberately misread and I would say dishonor the Egyptian material, because they are bending it to their agenda. Okay, Osiris does not have the kind of physical resurrection. In other words, back to the land of the living that you see in the New Testament. Osiris becomes animate again, but he is in the realm of the dead. That's where he is. He doesn't go back to earth. It is a deliberate misreading of Egyptian material. And if I were an Egyptian, I'd be offended. Okay? But again, the Zeitgeist crowd won't tell you stuff like this. They will draw superficial analogies to, one text to the other, again, to drive a particular agenda they have. And that is, I can't think of a better word for it. That's just dishonest. I mean, you can reject the claims of the New Testament, but at least be honest when you're doing it. That's just dishonest. And if it's not dishonesty, it's incompetence. So take your pick. You're either not real smart or you're just deceptive. Just be honest. I don't believe X, Y, or Z. Fine. It's a free world. Believe whatever you want or not believe whatever you want, but just don't be deceptive or dishonest about it.
On the same sort of lines, when I was younger, I read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and I think they made movies based on that, didn't they? With Tom Hanks. Can't remember what it's called now. Da Vinci Code.
Yeah. What's his Dan Brown sort of?
Yeah.
I don't know if he credits Michael Bagent or not. Maybe he does. I don't want to say Brown stole some of the ideas, but I think he credits him.
Yeah, and so some of the premise is that Jesus might have been married. Is there any evidence in the Bible of that?
No, there's also no evidence for it in the Gnostic texts. And again, this is a case of deliberate deception. Dan Brown and others before him refer to a Nag Hammadi gospel text where it says that Jesus kissed Mary on the mouth. Well, guess what? If you actually go to the Nag Hammadi texts, and they're all printed in facsimile, they've all been transcribed and, of course, translated, where it says on the mouth, there's actually no text. It's a hole in the text. It literally doesn't exist. So Michael Bagent and Dan Brown and many others just decide to say he kissed her on the mouth, and then they extrapolated that from that they must have been married. It's entirely fabricated. Entirely. But again, it's you can't make movies out of examining ancient texts and saying, look, there's a hole there. That just doesn't sell tickets or books. Okay, what sells those things is to fill in the gaps and make a sensational story out of it and never tell people that, oh yeah, we made that up. But that is exactly what happened in this case. And again, I didn't publish the Nag Hammadi text. Okay, it's Brill. It's a respected academic publisher. James Robinson's the editor. He's a well-known scholar in the Gnostic world. He's favorably disposed to Gnosticism. Great. His edition of the stuff shows you, and you again go look at pictures of the text, the manuscripts themselves. There's a hole there. So again, this is what sort of yanks my chain. People can believe whatever they want, and if you're honest, then you can have a discussion about, okay, what's more coherent, what you assign validity to or what I assign validity to. Then you can have an intelligent discussion. But what you can't have an intelligent discussion about is when someone either doesn't know they're being lied to, there's a hole here, or they don't care, because the first person has been deceived and maybe doesn't want to look at the data. The second person has just jump the shark. That's an American expression. I don't know if your listeners will be familiar with that, but they've just detached themselves from reality.
We have a lot of American listeners, by the way, as well. So
okay. Yeah, I mean, you've just willingly detached yourself from rationality, from reality, and the reality is there's a hole there. So if you just want to deny that, well, then nothing I say is going to help. You're like a Christian flat earther, and there are some of those out there that just make me want to cry, to be honest. That's where you're at. Nothing. I can't appeal to your rationality because it's gone at that point. So this is the kind of thing I object to.
In Holy Blood, Holy Grail, it is full of quite a lot of speculative language that's kind of similar to Ancient Aliens, really, saying phrases like "could it be" or "what if."
Yeah, that's there so nobody can successfully sue the guy. It's a cottage industry of sensationalistic stuff, and I'm not on the other side of this that says, and anybody who knows me knows I'm not on this side of it either, that if the church told you that must be the way to look at it. Okay, I'm not there either by any stretch. Okay, what I care about are the texts. What can the text sustain? Don't lie about the text. Analyze the text for what it said. A writer actually meant to communicate something here. Let's do our best to try to figure that out. Context is king, all this stuff. What I'm opposed to is fabrication. I'm opposed to the sort of tunnel vision that you get within organized religion, where this text must mean this because our forefather, some guy living in the 2nd or 3rd century, said it does. that's just as illegitimate to me. Okay, that guy that early church father may have been a wonderful guy and was probably smarter than I am. Okay, I'll own both of those things. But guess what? He's over a millennia removed from the text he's talking about. He couldn't read Hebrew, and he didn't have any of these other primary texts from the ancient Near Eastern world even translated in his own language so that he could recapture the context. Fortunately, I do. That puts me at an advantage. I don't have to be as smart as Augustine or some other guy. I don't have to be, in their shoes, because I just have more material that they didn't have. And so it behooves me to get off my butt and do some work here to understand these texts. I'm not just going to take what this guy who couldn't read Hebrew said about it. I'm sorry, but that just doesn't make much sense. So I'm not on the other side either. It's just I care about the text and what they can sustain, and let's try to be honest with data. It's not that much more complicated, at least with what I try to do.
And regarding the text, there's a lot of people, again, probably non-Christians, who would say that you can't really believe this as a holy book. The original text has changed over the centuries, and also that the books that were chosen to put in the Bible were chosen by, religious leaders, and there were actually other books as well that were discarded. Is there any truth to the fact that the original text has changed over the centuries, and why were the choices made for the particular books?
Well, there's no way to argue coherently that let's just say the book of Isaiah is in every letter exactly the same today as it was when Isaiah or whoever penned it. Okay. But that, again, that takes something that's obvious, and then people extrapolate to the absurd with it, or to the incoherent. It's not that, every other word in Isaiah is now a different word, or every 10th word, in Isaiah is a different word. That is just not true. Does it make any difference if Isaiah said to or unto? Ooh, what big truth hangs on those two prepositions? Which one was who cares? Okay, ultimately, who cares? It doesn't change meaning. There are lots of changes in spellings. There are lots of changes at a minute level by copyists. It's really unusual if you have a textual difference between manuscripts where interpretation really is affected. And I can say that with confidence. You know why? Because people have devoted their lives to collecting these things, and they've been published. They're in apparatuses you can buy, either in digital or print form, to study the Hebrew Bible. We know what this stuff is. Okay, so it's a misunderstanding of the process of textual transmission to say that, the text has just changed everywhere. We can't know what the guy was talking about. Well, actually, with 99% of the time, yeah, we can know quite well what he was talking about. Again, if we disregard, is it Stephen with a V or with a PH? Oh, that's a change in the text. Oh, what are we going to do? Well, let's just abandon all hope, all you who enter here to read this text. It's just absurd. But that's the way people want to characterize this. Isaiah didn't write his book, and now we have the phone book. Again, it's just an absurdity. It's equally absurd to think, again, that we have every letter in exact sequence and nothing ever. I mean, that's an absurdity on the other side. Lots of people devoted their lives to collecting and collating manuscript data and analyzing it, producing the data so that others can analyze it so that you don't have to take their word for it. It's painstaking, I would say mind-numbing work. I'm glad I'm not a textual critic, but I'm glad textual critics are out there, that I can use the things they produce to look at text. It's wonderful. But let's not take, again, something that's real and extrapolate to the absurd or the incorrect. Now, when it comes to the books, this is actually a less mysterious process, again, than people want to portray. I think the New Testament is more poorly understood, or maybe I should say deliberately sort of tarnished than the Old Testament. I mean, there's within their respective communities, okay, within the Jewish community, all the way back, to biblical times, there were people recognized as prophets, spokespeople for God. What they wrote, what their disciples wrote as they recorded their sayings, those were collected and they were assigned, a particular status. It's a very neat line of tradition on the Old Testament side. There were only 2 or 3 books that people argued about. Song of Solomon. Oh, there's a lot of sexual content in there. Should we really give this the same status? Okay. Ecclesiastes. Oh, the guy sounds like such a pessimist, even though you could disagree with that. Should we put it in or not? Is this sacred or not? Again, there's 2 or 3 of those. But the Jewish community, again, reached consensus, and it was an overwhelming consensus. And so we have this thing we call the Old Testament. New Testament side, there's this myth about, that all of these Gospels, they have the 4 that are in the New Testament and these other ones that, are from Nag Hammadi, Gnostic, Gospels. All of these were at one time considered equal in status, but then the organized church came about and just, weeded out the ones they didn't like. Again, that is not the case, because we have lists of which books the worldwide, again, speaking of the Mediterranean here at that time in history, the Roman Empire, we have lists of Gospels and, wider than that, the whole New Testament, books that were assigned sacred status by the believing community all over the known world. No Gnostic Gospel is ever in any list. Okay, that tells you right away that they weren't even debated. And in particular, the Gospel of Thomas, which is the one that sort of gets the most news. That was of Eastern origin, in the Eastern wing of the church, the Eastern part of the empire. Where that was circulated the most, we have a book called Tatian's Diatessaron now, and what it was a harmony of the Gospels. Even Tatian didn't include Thomas in his harmony. He assigned it lesser status. Okay, so even though the Gnostics may have liked a book or whatever, there were other Christians living in the same geographical regions that when you polled them, okay, when you asked them which ones should be assigned, this particular status to, they're never included. Now that doesn't mean they're not valuable. I mean, I take a book like First Enoch. Lots of Christians, like the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch was really important, and we ought to read it. But a book doesn't have to be canonical. It doesn't have to be viewed as inspired for it to be important. Enoch was very important, at least to Peter and Jude, because they draw ideas from it in the books that they wrote that wind up in the New Testament. All of this stuff is important. We ought to read all of it, because the New Testament writers were familiar with a lot of it. Now, the Gnostic Gospels post-date. They're later by a century or more than the canonical Gospels. That's really the reason they weren't included in the list, because they were Johnny-come-latelys. They were things written well after the apostolic period. So that's why they don't show up in any of these early lists, because they weren't around. It's not that they were weeded out. And there's this myth about, Constantine determined what New Testament at the Council of Nicaea. Well, guess what? We actually have notes from the Council of Nicaea, and Constantine didn't do that. What Constantine did, and for your listeners, if they want to read a really good book on this, it's an academic book, but it's readable. Constantine's Bible is a really good book on this. What Constantine did was he said, look, fellas, I called this conference, the big questions are, the deity of Jesus and the whole Aryan matter and all that kind of stuff. But they made a list of decisions, and one of the things that Constantine wanted, he said, look, I'm essentially tired of this bickering or this indecision about, sacred status of books. I want you guys to produce X number of copies. It was either 50 or 100. The number escapes me, but I want copies produced of the New Testament, and I want them distributed. And he gave them a time frame. Okay, I want this done. And he's like, so long. So he puts the church in a pickle. He puts them in a difficult position. So now the church has to decide, okay, how are we going to do this? And the church comes up with a simple method. Give us the list of books that everyone accepts and that there's no bickering about. And that's going to become our New Testament. We are going to assume that the Spirit of God will move in the masses, the mass of the believing community, that if there's an overwhelming consensus of these are the ones that we can trace to apostolic authority, and that's our minimalist list, then that should be good enough, and we will put those, we will bind them in one volume, and we'll copy them, we'll make the emperor happy, so he's not mad at us and that kind of thing. Constantine didn't pick the books. He just said, get it done. And they did. And the New Testament we have today is this minimalist list. It's the ones that everybody agreed on. So if it's not in the New Testament, it's because there was significant disagreement among the whole, the church, worldwide church at the time. There was disagreement about it, or it didn't win any favor. And the canonical Gospels, again, were part of that. Again, and the reason is because they were late. They couldn't be traced to apostolic authority or from the hand of an apostle. If it was a couple centuries beyond the apostolic period, well, of course they couldn't have written it. Of course one of their companions that they traveled with, like Luke, of course he couldn't have written it. It's not from the apostolic age, so by definition it doesn't have the same status. Again, it's not rocket science, but we've turned this into some conspiratorial one person cabal named Constantine that picked the books of the New Testament. It's just not true from the primary documentation of the period.
Yeah, thanks for going into that. That clears up a few things for me. Anyway, I wanted to sort of compare the Old and New Testament a little bit. They're quite different in some ways. In the Old Testament, it seems like there's a God who can be quite violent in some ways. Condoning the cutting off of limbs and things like that, which is still practiced today in places like Saudi Arabia. And then you've got the New Testament with Jesus, and seems to be a very peaceful kind of guy. How do we kind of explain the big differences between the Old and the New Testament, and the kind of feeling you get from both of those books?
Yeah, I think it's legitimate to say if you read through the Testaments, Old and New Testament, if you just read through it, quickly, you're going to get this impression. But if you drill down a little bit, it's less of a distinction than you would think. And what I mean by that is the covenant that God establishes in the Old Testament with his people in Deuteronomy 7 and 8. Very bluntly, he says, the Lord chose you because he loved you. He also, cares for the Gentiles, the Abrahamic covenant. Through you, through the descendants of Abraham, all the other nations will be blessed. And this is God's idea, to bless the nations. Okay, there are lots of acts of mercy to both Israelite and non-Israelite in the Old Testament. There are calls to repentance all over the Old Testament so that mercy can be extended. The God of the Old Testament gets portrayed as though he's a merciless killing machine or something like that. And you can only say that if you weed out all of the passages to the contrary. And there are a lot of them. Now, in the New Testament, you get more of an emphasis on love, through Jesus. But guess what? It's the God of the Old Testament in biblical theology who sent Jesus. It's the God of the Old Testament who was planning to do this during the Old Testament days. This whole messianic idea. And the Messiah is never focused only on his own portion, drawing from Deuteronomy 32:9. It's never focused only on Israel or only on the Israelite or the Jew. It's always focused on the entirety of all peoples. And that comes to fruition in the New Testament. And because the New Testament takes the story from the point of the incarnation, the story of the Messiah, and so on and so forth, then it naturally gets emphasis because this is the point that we are at now. But all of these good things that you see in the New Testament have their antecedents in the Old, including the whole John 3:16 thing. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Okay, that isn't a New Testament idea invented in the New Testament period. That is an Old Testament idea whose culmination is reached in the New Testament. So there's a bit of a disconnect. Even there are, I would say it's legitimate to see one thing more prominent than the other, but it's a misunderstanding and a misreading to say one testament has only this idea and the other testament has only that idea. That isn't, something that you can say and be correct. But prominence, you can make a case for that because of the history of Israel. There's a lot of warfare going on. Incidentally, the violence of the Old Testament, it's predicated on certain metaphors about God. God is a father. God has children. People who want to kill God's children, God retaliates against and kills. Okay, I would do the same for my children. I don't have any problem, I didn't. My kids are older now. But I had no problem. I can't remember a specific instance of ever doing it. There might have been one. I don't know. But I could look my little kids in the eye and say, look, if somebody breaks into the house and if daddy has to kill that person to save you and mommy, daddy will do that. I hope that never happens, but daddy will do that. In other words, I'm telling you, I value your life so much that I will take another life to preserve yours. Okay, there's a reason why there are father and son, father and children, family metaphors in the Old Testament used constantly about God. The whole bride, Israel is the bride of God. It's the same thing. This is why God is portrayed as jealous, because he's made a commitment to Israel, and the metaphor to express that commitment is marriage. Well, if I love you and I've committed myself to you against all others, that I'm not going to pick any others, I'm not going to violate, our marriage, and if you violate it, I'm going to be mad. My jealousy is going to derive from the fact that I loved you and committed myself to you, and you've lied to me. Again, family metaphors are ubiquitous in the Old Testament, and this is the framework for some of this other language, and we kind of lose that. But when we examine ourselves, our own hearts, I think you'd be a poor husband if you weren't angry and jealous if your wife violated your marriage. I think you'd be a poor father if you didn't defend your children to the ultimate extent. I think you'd be a lousy dad if you didn't do that. And again, this is the way it's cast in the Old Testament, but we kind of miss that because we get focused on the particular description of a battle or this particular command where God, tells Joshua, go and, wipe out this town. And we don't ask questions like, well, who's in the town? What are they thinking? Why are they doing this? Is there a rationale to this that might be a decade old or centuries old or whatever? What's going on here? What's the bigger picture? We tend to not ask questions like that. Again, because we're not thinking on the same terms as the writers, the original writers and the original readers. How they would have read these things.
Yeah, and the New Testament definitely does seem to be more peaceful, but
it is.
People sometimes point to one phrase that Jesus said. I came not to send peace, but a sword. Is there any linguistic analysis that can cast more light onto what was meant by that?
Yeah, that statement actually appears in both Matthew and Luke. And interestingly enough, there's a very similar statement in the Gospel of Thomas about this. But what's usually quoted is Matthew's version, and that's a little shorter. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, Matthew 10:34. Over in Luke, we have, do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. And then he says, father against mother and so on and so forth. It's a longer passage. Well, that's important because the phrase about division within the household not only gives it context, but also links it back into the Old Testament. Jesus is actually drawing on something in the Old Testament. And that is the notion of tribulation. So this statement by Jesus is not some statement that, hey, I want everybody to start gathering swords so that we can go attack, our enemies. It's not an offensive weapon kind of thing. If you link it back to the Old Testament, specifically in Micah 7, verses 5 and 6 thereabout, which Matthew 10 actually quotes, part of it. The idea is that when the Messiah comes, before Israel is restored from exile completely, before that happens, there's going to be a lot of strife. Specifically in Matthew 10 and in Luke, it's set in the context, the wider context of the persecution of believers. That's what the concept of tribulation is in both Testaments. The Old Testament refers to it, for instance, as the time of Jacob's trouble. So it's the followers of the Messiah that right before, again, the ultimate restoration of Israel, associated with the messianic presence, they're going to be in severe trouble. People are going to be after them to kill them. They're going to be under persecution. It's going to be bad, and it's going to be violent. So Jesus says, look, in one passage, it's not just a sword. Take up a sword, but take a cloak with you. Be ready to flee. Again, this is an endorsement of self-defense, self-protection. It's not let's arm ourselves and create an army here. And it's easy to see the rest of the story of the Gospels and on into the book of Acts and of course the epistles. This is the way it's always cast, that we are allowed to protect ourselves. We are under persecution. We should be willing to suffer, again, as Jesus suffered. And again, look at what Jesus says, again, right before one of these statements in Luke. He says, I came to cast fire on the earth, and would it that it were already kindled again, because then, the kingdom of God is going to be restored. And he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress. In other words, Jesus says, look, they're going to come and get me. And as the things that you see me suffer, you are going to suffer too. And this is the way it was foretold. This is what's going to happen. So yeah, get ready to take up your cloak so that you can flee in the night. Take up a sword. Luke chapter 22. You're going to need them. You're going to have to defend yourselves because you are going to become public enemy number one as I am public enemy number one. So be ready for it. This is part of my coming. This is just what's going to happen. So again, we tend to in our day, again, read that as, oh, well, Jesus sounds just like, this other group over here, go out and kill people. Again, you have to tear it out of not only its own context in the Gospels, other things Jesus says near to it, in near proximity to it, but you also have to tear it out of its Old Testament context to read it that way. But people do that. It's just what they do.
We started at the beginning, and we're moving closer to the end now, and so probably appropriate to talk about the end and the second coming of Christ and Revelations. Do you think there's any clues in the Bible that can give us a more understanding of when Jesus might be coming back, and as to who people like the Antichrist might be?
Yeah, I don't think we're given any sort of specificity on that. So I guess I get to play the stick in the mud there. Lots of people want to come up with these intricate chronological schemes or blood moon astronomy stuff, and again, we are not told any of that in the New Testament. My view of end times is we're not supposed to know. And I base that on what happened the first time around. I'll go into churches sometimes, and again, just to wake people up, I'll say things like, do you realize there's no verse in the Old Testament that describes a dying and rising Messiah who would atone for the sins of mankind? And people look at you like you got two heads, hey, you're in church. How can you say that? But it's true. There is no one verse that says that. The messianic profile is not given in a verse or two or three or four. It is scattered in 100 places. It is fragmented. You could only discern it after the fact. And this is what the Gospels actually tell us. I mean, there's a scene where you have the resurrected Christ in the upper room with the disciples. He's standing in front of them, and the text says he had to open their minds to understand. They still don't get it, even at that point. And the reason they don't get it is because it's not spelled out. It's not clear. And Paul has a really interesting phrase as to why this is. In 1 Corinthians 2, he says, had the rulers of this world known, Again, rulers of this world is a Pauline phrase for the spiritual powers of darkness. He said, had the rulers of this world known what was going to happen, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. Because this is the thing that had to happen for death to be overcome, for spiritual victory, for the powers of darkness to be defeated ultimately. This is the thing that had to happen, the event of the cross. And Paul's saying, look, if they could have figured this out, they would have never done it, because they're not morons. And that's the way prophecy really works. It's cryptic. It's scattered in 100 places. You're not supposed to just be able to read it and know. And my view is, look, if this is the way it worked the first time around, this is why the second time around, all this second coming stuff, this is why there are so many ambiguities. This is why no one can figure out a system. This is why even Jesus himself, when he came as a man, again, you have the limitations of incarnation. He says, look, even I don't know the exact time, the day or the hour. There are some generalities we can talk about, but even he, had to say that. And it's because this is by design. The ambiguity is by design. So my view of prophecy is just that. But again, that doesn't sell books. It doesn't, get you likes on Facebook, or things like that. It just, I get to be the stick in the mud. So go ahead and try out your new system. Again, I can understand it, and I will know, again, because of my training, I will know all of its weaknesses that you will not tell your readers about. And that's just unfortunate, because you're leading them to believe a certain thing that when it turns out to not be true is going to damage them.
But it doesn't, when it talks about the mark of the beast, doesn't it sort of almost seem to encourage people to calculate it? It says something like, let him who understands calculate,
Yeah, let him who understands. I mean, it's interesting that, John there in Revelation, he he gives you the number. So it's not that you have to figure out the number because he gives it to you, but you have to figure out the meaning of the number. And the text, you can translate it one of two ways. This is the number of a man, or you can also translate it, this is a human number. And if you take the second option, then that takes you into the whole area of gematria. Now, gematria does show up in the Bible in a few legitimate places. I don't believe in Bible codes. I think the premise of Bible codes, specifically the equidistant letter sequencing codes, is just doomed from the outset. It's dead on arrival because of how manuscripts work. But something like gematria, where you have numbers that correspond to letters, again, this is very old. It's not just in the Bible. It's in other texts that people use this technique because they use letters of the alphabet to represent numbers as well. It's nothing mystical. But if you take that approach, then 666 can point to certain individuals, again, depending on how you understand it. Or it can point to something called magic squares, which were a big part of the New Testament world. And 666, let's just take the latter. 666 is the magic square of the sun. And the representation of the sun was Zeus. Zeus's Old Testament counterpart was Baal. And so you have, again, a not a terribly cryptic, but you have an encrypted reference to this person will be identified with the Satan figure. Okay, he'll be the personification of evil. And that's about all you can conclude from it. Well, you can sort of get that from the rest of the story in Revelation too. But if you take it as spelling, mathematical spelling, well, then you get, somebody like Nero Caesar, whose name can be 666, depending on how you spell his title and his name. It can also be 616, which is a number that shows up in other manuscripts of Revelation instead of 666. So Nero has the advantage or the disadvantage of actually matching both, depending, again, how you spell his name in either Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. Again, we're just not told more than that. If it points to Nero, okay, well, has the Antichrist already come and gone? Again, that's a logical question. Or is this the type of person we can expect? Again, that's an interpretive issue. Who knows? So even that has a certain elasticity that you won't know until after the fact until you see all the rest of these things that are in Revelation, some of the other epistles, until after you see them play out in real time, then you'll be able to look back and go, okay, now I know which path I should have taken interpretively, but I couldn't figure that out ahead of time.
So you haven't stayed up late at night trying to calculate if Obama's the Antichrist or anything?
No, I don't like Obama's politics, but I think I can say with a fair amount of certitude that he is not the Antichrist.
And just a couple of more things actually. Wormwood. I was always interested in what that refers to, and I know you're not a big believer in Planet X, but do you have any theories as to what this Wormwood star might be?
Well, I think it is an astronomical or a celestial referent. I mean, we get we get these things in the Gospels, the sign of the Son of Man. Okay, the stars in heavens will be shaken. You get wormwood. You get this again astronomical symbology, the celestial stuff, and it could be a reference to astronomical portents. In other words, what scholars would refer to as astrotheology, the idea that the heavens could communicate in broad terms when certain things were happening, when epochs were beginning and ending, when, a divine king was being born and all that kind of stuff. I mean, and that's legit. And on the broader terms, I mean, Paul actually discusses things like that in Romans 10. And he quotes Psalm 19, the heavens declaring the glory of God, the signs in the heavens have a voice, all this kind of thing. So, in broad terms, there is this notion, again, that acts in the heavens can be portents of what God is up to, just in broad strokes. But beyond that, I don't think you can really, align it successfully in an interpretive sort of way with anything terribly specific, because we just aren't told this sort of thing. Now, the Planet X thing, my criticism of that really goes back to what Zecharia Sitchin and his followers did or still do with his ideas, based on, I can't even say his reading of cuneiform text, because he literally just makes stuff up too that don't exist in the text. But essentially what he does here, that there's this planet Nibiru that the Anunnaki come from. It cycles through our solar system every 3,600 years and blah, 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 blah. Well, again, the cuneiform texts don't say any of that. They don't say any of that about Nibiru. It never connects Nibiru with the Anunnaki. He literally just made it up. I mean, I have a video, a very boring video, on one of my websites, sitchiniswrong.com, where I take people to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. Here we are. It's a screen capture video of Mike at the website. Type in the term for Anunnaki, hit the button. There you get all the references in Sumerian literature to the Anunnaki. Go look them up. Hit the little TR so you get an English translation and look them up. There's a little over 100 of them. When I tell you that this idea does not exist, that the Anunnaki are never connected to Nibiru and all this sort of stuff, when I tell you it's made up, don't take my word for it. Go look. Go run the search yourself. Again, it's boring, but I'm trying to get people to go look at primary texts. And so I don't, when it comes to Planet X, that's the thing I'm sort of shooting at. I'm not shooting at the idea that the ancients would associate cataclysmic religious events or cataclysmic earthly events with portents in the sky. They certainly did some of that, but I don't think we're told, again, really too much in terms of specifics as like what wormwood is. Which object is it? Is it an asteroid? Is it something else? Or is it just symbolic of something more generally chaotic in the heavens? We're just not told.
And do you think that's part of the problem, is that analysing the facts is a bit boring, and actually believing
yes, I'm the lord of boredom when it comes to that.
No, but people find escapism and fantasy a bit more alluring sometimes.
No, that's true. And I'll confess, I I like things like science fiction that take this material and then reimagine it in a storyline and some epic narrative. That's fun. I enjoy it. But I always caution people, especially Christians, with just saying, look, an obsession with this kind of stuff is really a waste of time. It not only is going to be ultimately fruitless, because you can erect a beautiful system, but I can tell you right now, and if we get into a conversation, I will expose it. I know, because there are weaknesses in all of these erected systems. I know where the weaknesses are because I've taught through this stuff. This is my training. Okay. You can do that. It looks beautiful and wonderful, but only because you've masked or omitted or explained away the outliers. Why spend so much time trying to erect one of these and then defend it? Why aren't you out doing the things that Jesus really wanted you to do? You know, bearing one another's burdens, you know, taking care of people, giving them the gospel. You know, why aren't you doing that? Instead, you're sitting there with your calipers and your calculators and your astronomical charts or whatever. You know, it's just not productive. It's not. This is not part of the Great Commission. You know, it's also not part of the gospel. And I know people that get so married to their system of end times thinking that if you don't believe it, then they question your commitment to the gospel. They question, are you really a Christian? And that is just, that's bad theology right there. I mean, that is so misguided to connect these ideas, but people just get sucked into this because it's fun to think about. There's a wonder, a mystery element to it. But you got to realize, look, if you believe, you know, Mr. Christian, if you believe that this thing that you call the New Testament is inspired, that it really came from God, and if there are ambiguities in it, why don't you believe that that was God's decision, that God wants it that way, and then just leave it there? Why are you trying to improve on this thing God gave you? People don't want to hear that. But again, I'm the guy who gets to play the stick in the mud and gets to tell people that, and, you know, winning hearts and minds every day doing it. I just think we should be honest with the material at our disposal.
And how just to finish, last question: how are people taking the information that you're presenting? Do you have? I'm sure you have some support. Is it equal support, and people are against the message?
The only real measure I have of that is, okay, the book, The Unseen Realm. Again, and what the book is really about is I'm trying to convince people, look, the right context for interpreting the Bible is not yours. It's not the Reformation. It's not the Catholic Church. It's not the Puritans. It's not American evangelicalism. It's none of these. These are all alien contexts. The right context for interpreting the Bible is the context that produced the thing. So I want the Israelite living in your head. I want the first century Jew living in your head, because these are the people who produce the thing that God chose to produce it. And that's the only way you're really going to understand it. Now that's greeted predominantly, if you go look at Amazon, go look at reviews of the book, overwhelmingly people are appreciative of that. I do get a few people that, I mean, there's one review up there that I just love that says, this book just freaked me out and I stopped. Don't read it. You know, I mean, thank you for being honest. You know, I like that one, because that tells you right where that person's at, that I'm not playing in your box and you need the box. Well, again, I understand that's what happens, but overwhelmingly, I think people are appreciative of the fact that, look, let's just sort of try to look at it the way they would have looked at it and see what sort of comes out of that. And that's thrilling to a lot of people because they discover so many new things. They don't have blinders on. You know, they haven't had the content filtered to them through their own traditions. So if that's a measure, then I'm happy. I mean, I have plenty of detractors and enemies and haters on the internet. I mean, I can read comments on my blog, and I get things by email, that call me this or that name. So you get that, but it's not going to deter me from doing what I do, because ultimately I do think that this is more interesting than having content filtered to you through layers of tradition. if you assign importance to this book, especially if you assign something like sacred status to this book, then you ought to be reading that book on its own terms, not someone else's. And I think that's valuable.
And so the book you've written is the Unseen Realm. And what's the? Can you give us details about your website?
Sure. My homepage is Dr, as in Dr. DRMSH. Those are my initials. drmsh.com. And that's sort of my nerve center. I have, a bunch of other websites. I have 3 blogs. I have a podcast of my own, the Naked Bible Podcast. People can go to my homepage, drmsh.com, and find anything else I do, including links to the book. But you can go right up to Amazon, either in the UK or, any other Amazon site for that matter, and find the book there. So just put my last name in, an Unseen Realm, and you will find it, and other things too. But that's the one that is the most current.
Well, thank you very, very much for coming on Truth Sentinel. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and in some ways it kind of made me think that this is what sermons at churches should be like, answering really difficult questions, and some of the questions that people have been asking for a long time that rarely get answered in church. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And by the way, I do agree with that.
Thanks, Michael.
Yep. Thank you.